Hello, this is a continuation of Unfortunately for Society, Izuku is a Khanivore. Written by LouieTheDragon, read by Stick. Chapter 6. Why do you stay with him? Security mostly. Summary. Some, sports festival events and some intimidation shenanigans. Trigger warnings for this chapter. There is a little bit of explicit content, and if you are not comfortable with this, the timestamps are in the description. A few more days passed until it was finally time for the UA Sports Festival. Izuku sat in the bar with Shigaraki and Kirigiri. He was slumped over in his seat, elbows on the bar, waiting for the festival to start. Izuku huffed and said to Kirigiri, "Give me something as dark and bitter as my soul, please." He added on. He didn't bother the look beside him when Shigaraki snorted. Kirigiri responded, "Of course, here." Izuku looked over and watched as the man placed a glass of chocolate milk in front of him. Beside him, Shigaraki cackled. Izuku frowned, looking up at Kirigiri. "Come on, my soul is darker than that," he told him. The misty bartender looked at him for a moment before putting more chocolate syrup into his glass and mixing it. Izuku studied it for a second, and then he smiled brightly. "Perfect." He sipped his milk happily, quietly humming a nameless tune. The festival started, and Izuku watched as the obstacle race went on, and Katsuki fought head-to-head with a red and white-haired boy. Soon, though, the obstacle race ended in that boy, Todoroki, he believes, taking first. He got 10 million points on his head, and in the team-up that followed, his team managed to keep almost the entire game, only to lose at the last second to a girl that Izuku thought looked like a frog. And then, the part Izuku had been waiting for, the one-on-one battles. Oh, he was so excited. He was pretty far from both of the other occupants of the bar. He knew what was going to happen, as it happened nearly every year since middle school. He brought down one of his hands and lightly palmed himself, and used his other hand to cover his mouth. The first fight started, and it was Shinso against a boy with a copy cork. Shinso merely spoke, and Izuku watched the others respond, and then fall slack. Walking out of the ring himself, oh, that was so hot. He didn't even care that there wasn't even actual fighting happening. The fight went on, and Izuku, who completely ached as each fight happened, was trying not to rut against the counter. He was using his own hand to massage himself as well. He let out soft whines, barely covered by his hand, and then hurriedly excused himself to go to the bathroom when he couldn't handle it anymore. He closed the door behind him and locked it. He then sunk to the floor and onto his knees. Oh, he hastily unzipped his pants and grabbed his stick. Just one pump was all it took for him to come all over the floor, but he was so achingly hard again, and so he replayed those fights over in his head. Izuku's internally glad that the walls are soundproof. He checked, because he couldn't stop the pleasured moans from slipping out. He could hear faint explosions coming from the TV. He knew exactly who it was. Then he nearly fell face forward as he cupped his balls and gave his cock a hard squeeze. He came for a second and third time, nearly growling. His eyes rolled to the back of his head as his back arched and his tongue flicked out, forked and thin, smelling the salt-tinted air. He let a shiver rack his body, with his fingers resting on the floor in a claw-like manner. Wow, he definitely never had this extreme of a reaction before. He gave in to the urge to let himself grow into the creature, still small enough to fit in the bathroom. Izuku was near feral and knew it was going to be loud, so he found a metal bar attached to the wall and clamped his mouth around it as he made himself come once again. The amount of pleasure was mind-boggling, especially when he was the creature. It was so much more than he was human. He could feel the rightness as it coursed through his veins. He knew he was at his end for now and shifted back to look human. It was more difficult than he was expecting. He cleaned up his mess on the floor as well as himself. That's when he looked at the handbar and saw it completely twisted and crushed. He was slightly surprised of his strength once more, relinquishing in his first. A small smile grew on his face as he unlocked the door and told Karagiri and Shigaraki that he was leaving. Karagiri bade his goodbye, and Shigaraki just nodded at him, which Izuku figured was the best he was going to get. He walked out of the bar instead of using Karagiri because he figured he needed to walk after that. Izuku was relinquishing in the lingering euphoria. He walked through alleyways, enjoying the evening weather. There weren't many people about, due to the masses being at the UA Sports Festival. Izuku walked towards a common villain meeting point, which was kind of neutral turf for villains and thugs alike. It was about the size of a city block, and he knew he entered it when there were people lingering around, watching him cautiously as he passed them. Some people even flattened themselves against the walls or buildings as he walked by. His villain's alias was rather infamous and was among the top dogs of the place, but Izuku liked it when people underestimate him, so he could show them their place when they try something. New people came into the place all the time, yet not a lot of these people had seen him face to face, and people tend to exaggerate. He got to the center hub, where there were dozens of people milling around. The center hub was a casual restaurant called Cat Tailor, and when many regulars laid eyes on him, they widened their eyes and took a few hasty steps backwards, parting the crowd to let him through. The other regulars who didn't see him took that as a cue to move out of the way as well. There were the newbies who were obvious, as they didn't know the danger they were in. He loved all these wondrous coincidences, for another old classmate of his was here with his brother, who recognized him and stepped back. The classmate of his looked confused and turned around, only to spot Izuku. Unfortunately for him, he ignored the wrongness of the atmosphere around him and started talking. "What, are you all scared of a stupid fucking Deku? He's nothing but a worthless, quirkless degenerate." The boy turned around to look at Deku, who had, with a small smile, an otherwise neutral look on his face. "What do you think you're doing in a goddamn villain hub? Did you get lost on your way home to mommy?" he taunted. Izuku could hear everyone else suck in a breath, horrified at what they were hearing. There were so many different moods that Izuku was in when he periodically entered, that these people had a right to be nervous, especially when he's never made it obvious until he spoke. Izuku made a show of licking his lips and putting a look of want in his eye, letting others know that though he was in a good mood, that didn't mean it was a good thing. The boy finally ran out of derogatory remarks and suddenly looked around at the wide circle that had been made by the surrounding people. The boy smirked and exclaimed, "Look at that! They even want a show of me putting down a worthless runt like you." Finally, Izuku opened his mouth and spoke softly. Is that really what you want? You can always back down now and nothing will have to happen here. The brother frantically tried to call his brother back behind a wall of people, but he was ignored. The boy didn't hear the obvious warning and shouted, "If this is a challenge, I ain't backing down, you little shit." Instead of a neutral look, Izuku suddenly pinned the boy with a stare and watched with giddy as the boy nearly froze in place. He looked off to the right to see his brother crouching down, mumbling what seemed to be a prayer. The other saw his line of sight and was confirmed by a nod of what they needed to do. One of the larger men took the brother by his scruff and tossed him in like a rag doll into the circle. The brother was whimpering pitifully on the ground. The boy scowled at his brother. "What the fuck are you crying about, dude? It's just Deku. That worthless Stop talking! You're only making it worse," the brother cried out. A small chuckle interrupted their conversation, and both boys froze and slowly turned their heads towards Izuku, whose smile was getting wider and wider, and continued to as seams in his cheek parted as well. The brother shook with despair. No, please," he begged. Head on the ground, Izuku laughed, a wicked, distorted sound coming out of his mouth with the entirety of his jaw split. "Oh, don't worry. I'll barely even touch him." The brother let out a huge sigh of relief, but froze as he realized the implications of what was just said. Izuku took a moment to look over at the boy, who was beginning to realize how majorly he fucked up. Izuku leaned his arms forward and bent down to a crouch, arms dangling and in front of him. His hands were shifting and becoming more jagged. The rest of his body followed suit. He took his time to transform into the creature up to about the size of a first-story house. He relished the increasing terror in the boy's face as he grew, and he decided to play with his food first. Really, the only reason he's doing this, instead of just ending it quickly, is because he knows the people around him often get bored, so he likes to give them a good show. It's also a good way to live up to his reputation. His eyes raked up and down his body, remembering him to be the kid with large teeth, or something. Izuku licked his lips, showing off a forked tongue that was very long. "Oh, pardon me. I forgot to introduce myself." The creature spoke, its mouth only slightly moving as it did. The boy quivered under his stare and sank to his knees. Izuku proceeded to put his head between the two brothers mere feet away. "My name," he looked at his former classmate, "is Quicklash." He twisted his neck, and in one swift motion, bit off the brother's head. Blood and viscera dripped from his teeth, and he growled in anticipation of a nice snack. He looked over at his classmate, flicking some blood off his teeth and onto the boy. That gained a flinch. He went back down and tore open the chest cavity and devoured the heart. The creature rippled like water, and it appeared bigger. Some of the other newbies couldn't hold their stomachs. It was hilarious. Izuku's form melted into shadow and swirled around the boy, slowing down until it floated at ear level. "Welcome to villainy," he cackled, distorting the air itself, and flew to the front of the door, letting the shower take shape into him. One of the thugs near the door scrambled to open the door for him. As he walked through the door, the barista gave him a warm greeting, and he reciprocated. It was as if he hadn't just bitten off someone's head. He sat in the corner of the room, so he was able to see all angles without having to watch his back. A waitress came over and asked his order. He wanted a nice, cool black tea to wash down the pieces of brain still stuck in his teeth. Some of the villains walked in, cautiously watching and waiting for Izuku to do something. Izuku relished in his own total authority over them. He sat back in his chair and gave the most innocent smile he could muster. "You're good?" he chirped. The newbies who walked in after the others froze in place. All of them were collectively thinking, what the fuck? "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Izuku looked at the man who he'd been watching over a few minutes now. It was obvious that the man had been gathering up his courage to come and speak to him, and wasn't that a sight? Izuku smiled and gestured for him to take a seat. Though the man was wearing a mask, he looked thankful. "Yes, is there a reason you're sitting here instead of anywhere else?" Izuku asked. The masked man chuckled nervously. "I've heard through the grapevine that you're part of the League of Villains?" Izuku blinked, not expecting this. Well, he wasn't sure what he was expecting. "And you went in then?" Izuku responded, a knowing look in his eyes. The man tipped his bowler hat. "Glad to see my intentions have been made clear," he told Izuku, who didn't see any harm in adding this dude to their lovely, chaotic crew. Izuku shrugged. "Not to be rude, but what's your quirk?" He looked at the man. Said man held up a gloved finger. "Ah, yes. I'm known as Mr. Compress, for my lovely ability to shrink anything into a small crystal-like ball." Izuku was impressed. He'd make a good member of the League. "Alrighty then." Izuku took a napkin and used the pen that he always kept on him to write down the address of the bar. He slid it over to Mr. Compress and told him, "When you get in there, tell Shiggy that Quick Lash sent you there. And it's important that you say Shiggy, so that he figures it's not someone pretending to be me." Compress took the napkin and stood up and gave a low bow. "My thanks," he said, as he walked out at the door of the restaurant. Izuku was pretty content with the situation and took another look around the room. He loves reactions, as he slowly stood up, not enough to be noticed right away, but enough that some of the patrons looked his way. He could honestly see why Katsuki liked attention so much. It was kind of addicting. A clear path was spread out for him, and except for this one dude who got in his way, so he gently pushed him aside. And by gently, he means no physical harm was done, and he just cleared his throat. The man gulped and scurried out of the way. Izuku continued to wander the streets, and he eventually found his way home. He opened the door and to see his mother. Inko fussed over him. "Are you okay? You were gone for a while, and I was getting worried." Izuku smiled. He'd realized he's been doing that a lot more recently, and hugged her. "Don't worry. I just had a light snack," he said. Inko didn't comment. The rest of the evening passed, and Izuku was happy to see that Shinso got third place in the sports festival. He sent a quick congratulations to him on his phone and got a smiley face in return. He soon got ready for bed and went to sleep, excited for the days to come.